the start of the year has been crazy, and so finally get to kind of sit down and take stock of where we're at.
Crazy is an understatement, Teri. I mean, when you think about energy and AI and everything that's happening around the money that's being spent and all of the articles that are being written, the word unprecedented gets thrown around a lot, but this truly is unprecedented.
You're absolutely right. And so we had this conversation, which was kind of a fun conversation about, hey, what's your top list of what's going to happen in 2026? And if we had to do, 5 questions worth asking, I think that's a good conversation for us to have.
Oh, for sure. And I always love chatting with you, Teri. I learn so much when we get together and chat. So this sounds great. So, well, let me throw it back to you, Teri. If we come up with these questions or thoughts or areas, let me throw it back to you. What sort of questions would you have for me, given, the world that I travel in and the things that I tend to focus on?
Absolutely. That's dangerous, Jeff. So I think, well, let's just start out. So I think the elephant in the room this year, hey, is AI a market bubble? Is it a market bubble? And the folks on my side, of the world, which is the electricity industry, are we going to be holding the bag of that AI bubble if it is one?
Well, so you're right. I mean, the elephant in the room, the $64,000 question, are we in a bubble? That's a great segue into this conversation. And I guess a couple of thoughts on that, Teri. I see a lot of comparisons between where we are today versus what we saw back in the dot-com bust. And you and I were around back then. And so we've got some experience with that. And we could spend a lot of time talking about these comparisons. I don't think they're necessarily all that fair. And importantly, the difference between what happened back in the dot-com bust and where we are today was about just a stranded capacity, right? So we had when you think about it, the dot-com bust was really a telecom bust. And I think the numbers are that like 80% of the fiber that was deployed back then was dark, meaning nobody was using it. Well, when you look at what we have today, there's no stranded data centers, there's no stranded energy resources. So it's a very different market from that perspective. And then kind of the way I think about the industry going forward, and again, we could spend a lot of time on this, but I try and keep things pretty simple. I think what a lot of people are worried about is this level of capital expenditure, is it sustainable? Because if it's not sustainable, well, then there are concerns that, things could roll over and we could have excess capacity. And the way that I think about it is when you look at the hyperscalers and you try and answer the question of capital expenditures to sustainability, you really just have to look at, are these good decisions they're making, right? Are they seeing a return on these decisions? Or these investments rather. And when you look at the return on invested capital metric, kind of geeking out finance a little bit, the answer to that question is these are good decisions. So as long as that return continues to go up and not down, I think that bodes well for the future of the industry and the money that's going to be spent. So that would mean, I guess, ultimately, I'm not necessarily in the bubble camp, not to say that there won't be some bumps along the way. And not to say that I know there are some companies that might be a little bit overextended, but overall, I think it's isolated, and I don't think we're going to have some contagious event across the market.
Yeah, so maybe frothy in terms of valuation and expectations, but much like the expectation that the internet, right, was going to be a bubble, and we saw also a similar ride. So I love that. Now, we've also thought about this in terms of a race. You commonly refer to this race. And from a geopolitical standpoint, the second day of Trump's return to office, he talked about a national priority, artificial intelligence being a national priority. So I want to talk to you about this. With the US and China, they seem to be on very different paths. And so let's talk a little bit about the philosophic differences in approach and what it may mean to the future of AI and AI-driven data center optimization and where we go from here.
Sure. And hey, look, I'm really excited to see what the federal government and the administration is doing as it relates to AI and taking it very seriously from an investment and a policy perspective, because we are in a race, right? We are in a race with China. And And this is a race we don't want to lose. We can ill afford to lose. I think we're in an area where AI leadership could beget political leadership. I don't want to be too much of an alarmist, but it's really important that we execute and maintain our lead in AI. And when you look at what China's doing, they are taking a different path, as you mentioned. They're approaching the industry more from an open source perspective. So the models that they're building, these are open models. And the way to think about that is, generally speaking, these models are free to developers who will then develop AI applications. And they're doing that, my guess is because they want to see these Chinese models proliferate across the world as easily as possible. And by making it free, that stands to reason that that might in fact happen. Whereas a lot of the US based models, they charge developers for access to these models to build applications. Now, the difference between, what you pay for and what you don't pay for is quality, right? Generally speaking, if you're paying for something, you're getting a better quality than if it's for free. And then, of course, there's the sort of the national security or sort of spying concerns that one might have as it relates to using a Chinese model versus an American model. That certainly bodes well for the U.S. In this whole race. But it is a race, and the way I think about it, Teri, it's just about execution too. It's like who can generate the most electrons and who can stand up data centers faster and who can build these models faster. I mean, those folks will generally win the race. So it's really important right now. And again, I think the administration recognizes that, but we need to move faster. We still need to move even faster than we are.
That's helpful. That is helpful.
Yeah. So let me ask you something, Teri.
Sure.
So I kind of mentioned policy a little bit as it relates to, what I think what the administration is doing from an AI perspective, but there's a broader, I think, policy conversation as it relates to energy and the way we're trying to manage this tidal wave of energy demand that we haven't really seen in what 20 25 years. And so talk to me a little bit about what your thoughts are around energy policy for this year.
Oh, absolutely. So, Jeff, I've written about this extensively. In fact, just published a piece which talks about reimagining service obligations in the age of the mighty prosumer. So, data centers are very unusual consumers. As we think about it, they're capable of actually building their own power plants. Oftentimes, they've got deeper pockets than the utilities that are servicing them. So, when we think about the old fashioned regulatory compact built 100 years ago, the question is it still relevant? Does it need to change? And who are we protecting here? Certainly, there's an argument that consumers are going to need protection to make sure that they don't shoulder the costs, but who should do it? Who's in the driver's seat? So, that rapid expansion of data centers is really highlighting the limitations of the US electricity regulatory framework, which, Jeff, if we're honest about it, it was originally designed to accommodate gradual, predictable increases in demand, not what we're seeing now. It's going to be evaluated in the proceedings before FERC right now, and the outcomes are going to have the potential at least to significantly alter how major electricity users, such as the data centers, procure their power and connect to the grid. And so central to these proceedings are key questions regarding jurisdiction. Should rulemaking authority for connecting large-scale loads to transmission system rest with the federal government or individual states? And additionally, should the consumers be permitted to have direct access to power generation facilities? So a lot of these questions are really what we're deciding now. So this first half of the year is going to be really important to watch because it's going to impact the state of the grid and consumers like you and me.
So that's fascinating. And also kind of scary, and it sounds enormous. It sounds like a huge policy undertaking. And
Right.
so I guess A, is that true? And then B, what can we expect from a timing perspective when we might actually see some movement here so that we can sort of, redraw the rules of engagement, if you will, so that we can move faster?
So right now, we had a pretty important discussion with the state regulators in DC along with FERC that occurred in February, just most recently. But you're going to see rulemaking occur likely in April. So about a month
Oh,
from now, it's going to be that quick. It'll likely be questioned with regard to who has the right or the authority to be able to regulate these data centers and how they connect. But Jeff, we're going to get a lot of clarity really in the next few months.
Well, that's great to hear. I'll be certainly paying close attention to that, as I know you will as well. So, Terry, I want to ask you about affordability because you
Mm.
hear a lot of pushback from communities across the country against data centers coming to their communities for a variety of reasons. But I think one of the bigger concerns is just, people don't want to have to pay more for their electricity bill just because data centers come to town. And that seems to be the prevailing narrative. I don't know if it's entirely true or not, but what are your thoughts on affordability in general?
Yeah, Jeff, we have to be clear here that your utility bill, so your electricity bill, has been rising faster than the headline inflation for the last 3 years. In fact, for the last 2 years has been double the level of headline inflation. So this is real. The costs that are being passed on are real. But the question is it the Johnny come lately, the data centers that are causing the rise in the increase in consumer costs? And the answer is well, sort of, right? The sort of in the sense that when you have a limited pool of supply and you have more users coming in, it's going to get more expensive. That's simply, the economics of it. But if we're clear about this, we haven't seen demand increase in the country for 20 years. And there has been this consistent underinvestment for growth. And so now that we're seeing growth, well, bills are rising. The good news here, however, is that we have deep pocketed investors that can pay for those costs. And when we think about 70% of the grid is end of life, meaning the components of the grid, Jeff, are 26 years or older. They're
Amazing.
also being exposed to the sort of weather conditions that we haven't experienced in the past. So grid hardening, grid resilience, and the need for replacement reinvestment is deep. And we have a new class of consumer coming to the table that can help shoulder those costs. So I think the thing is we've got to be careful, how we think about it. Pay for the costs that you're incurring, but certainly consumers can benefit here.
Those are great insights, Terry. Because I mean, you just hear it. I think that the reaction out there is data centers are bad and they're causing all these
Yes,
problems. I love that insight. That was great. Thanks for sharing that. That's certainly very helpful for me.
you've
So
got it. And
listen,
Jeff, don't forget, like I've got to tell you that, power procurement right now is the number one driver for siting a data center. Number one. But we are also seeing a lot of local community pushback. Very soon, the number one driver will be, where we can find communities that are willing to accept data centers building next door. And so this is important and important to watch, but we have to be really careful and have a balanced discussion about the benefits and costs of data center development.
yeah, another great point. I've been reading more about that sort of headwind for the industry, and I think that in part is probably why Elon Musk is talking about putting data centers in space. I think power access is one thing, but he's saying within 30 months he'll be launching data centers in space. So certainly something to pay attention to and watch as this whole industry evolves. But Terry, I want to ask you one last question, and it has to do with co-location of power assets, if you will, bring your own power. I'm reading a lot more
Yes.
about that, about data centers building their own natural gas power plants right next to a data center because of the challenges with connecting to the grid and transmitting energy over the grid. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, and this is a conversation we talked about, and I know a lot of our listeners have stayed tuned to the fact of co-location or siting behind the meter gas turbines. And Jeff, in some ways, it actually adds to the problem. So if we have a number of increased sources of competition for our gas turbine, well, the cost of that turbine is going to go up, and we may not all benefit from where it's located, right? So this is a problem. But we also have a business dilemma that you had mentioned the race that we're in right now, right? And we could very
Yeah.
easily lose the race if we can't build sufficient, or it'll be offshored. And we already see that occurring with regard to global data center activity. So we've got to be really clear here. The problem is that we could easily bypass the community investment that we could have. And we have co-ops that are actually really good at their jobs, meaning they're great at running these running the grid and running our local distribution systems. So I hate to see the bypass occur, but it's a fundamental issue that we have to solve this way, one way or another. One that would benefit all of us, and another that benefits a limited part of our universe.
Yeah, no, it just gets, there's so many different puts and takes here, if you will, around this challenge. But let me ask you one more thing, Teri. So if you co-locate a power plant next to a data center, and that's the primary source of energy for that data center, well, we know power plants go down, right? And they need to be serviced. But I also know that these data centers that are running these really complicated AI models, they don't want to go down, right? That can be very problematic when you have to pause for any length of time or the training of a model. So how does that work? Then all of a sudden, do we have the problem of this tidal wave of demand hitting the grid when the power plant's being taken down for servicing? And that doesn't sound doable, does it?
It doesn't. And Jeff, that is the problem we sort of spoke about on an earlier video where we talked about the fact is if that unit goes down and you're going out to the grid, are you paying for that optionality? Are you paying for access to the grid? Because when you go out, that's a socialized cost, that's a pool cost, and all consumers are going to pay a higher bill for that optionality. So if we're not careful in associating the cost as it's incurred by the data centers, then all of us will actually see that in our monthly bill. Got to be careful. And the hope being, and I don't think we're there, Jeff, but the hope being is that there might be a time that we have enough data center capacity that we have geographic flexibility. And the question is, are we there yet?
Yeah, my guess is no.
Hard no.
Hard no. I like that. Hard
Yeah.
no. Well, hey, this has been fun. We got to do this more often. I know we did one of these, gosh, I don't know, 6-9 months ago or something like that. So we
Right.
need to do more of this. This was great. I think really helpful too for people that are watching. At least I hope so.
Yeah, I hope our listeners have enjoyed this. And thanks so much for your time and insights. I appreciate being your colleague, Jeff.
Hey, I appreciate being your colleague as well, Teri, and it's always a pleasure to chat with you. So thanks for getting together today.